Once upon a time, in a castle that smelled faintly of roast pheasant and political anxiety, there lived a king with a crown too heavy and a heart too busy. His name? Henry VIII. You know him, the one with 6 wives, a penchant for jousting, and a mood that swung faster than a lute string in a tavern brawl. But tonight, we're not here for the wives. No Catherine, no Anne, no Jane. Tonight, we slip past the altar and into the velvet shadows. We're here for the whispers, the candlelit glances, the secret lovers. Henry VIII was not just a king, he was a romantic tornado wrapped in ermine. He loved with the intensity of a man who believed every woman was either his soulmate or his next scandal. His court was a carousel of flirtation where every dance could lead to a dalliance, and every poem might end in a pregnancy. He wrote love letters like a teenage bard with a quill dipped in desperation. He gave gifts that sparkled brighter than his political alliances, and he had a talent for falling in love with women who were either already married, related to someone important, or about to become a problem. But beneath the drama, beneath the velvet and the gossip, Henry was just tired. Tired of ruling, tired of marrying, tired of pretending he didn't hear the servants whispering about his latest crush. He longed for love, but also for sleep, and sometimes the two got tangled. So, as the moon rose over Hampton Court, and the courtiers tiptoed through tapestries of intrigue, Henry VIII sat in his chamber, sipping wine, scribbling sonnets, and wondering if the lady who smiled at him during dinner was flirting, or just had something stuck in her teeth. And thus begins our tale, a story of secret kisses, stolen glances, and the kind of royal romance that history barely bothered to record. Because when you're a king with a wandering heart and a very busy codpiece, bedtime is never boring. And before you drift off into Tudor dreams, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments from which castle, cottage, or cozy corner of the world you're watching from. Bonus points if you're in pajamas, fit for a monarch. Before Henry VIII was the king of 6 wives and 1,000 regrets, he was a young dashing monarch with a twinkle in his eye and a tendency to fall in love faster than a lute player at a wine tasting. Enter Elizabeth Bessie Blount. Bessie wasn't a queen. She wasn't even a lady of scandal, at least not at first. She was a courtier, a beauty, and a woman with the kind of smile that made Henry forget his Latin conjugations. Their affair began quietly, like a yawn in the middle of Mass, but soon it bloomed into something much louder, a royal romance with consequences. In 1519, Bessie gave birth to Henry Fitzroy, the king's only acknowledged illegitimate son. Henry was so thrilled, he practically threw a party with extra pheasants. He gave the boy 2 dukedoms and a name that literally meant son of the king. Subtle? Not really. Regal? Absolutely. But Bessie didn't get a crown. She got a quiet retirement, a respectable marriage to a nobleman, and a lifetime supply of awkward glances at court. Her reward for bearing the king's son, a polite exit and a footnote in history. Still, Bessie was the blueprint, the original royal side hustle, the mistress who proved that Henry's heart and other organs were very much operational. She paved the way for the whispers, the glances, and the candlelit chaos to come. And as Henry scribbled sonnets and Bessie faded into the background, the court moved on. But the servants remembered, the tapestries remembered, and somewhere in the velvet folds of history, Bessie Blount still smiles. Before Anne Boleyn became the queen with a sharp tongue and a sharper fate, her sister Mary was already warming the royal bed. Yes, dear dreamer, before the crown, before the drama, before the unfortunate neck situation, there was Mary, the original Boleyn girl in Henry's heart, or at least in his chambers. Mary Boleyn was beautiful, charming, and had the kind of reputation that made French courtiers blush and English nannies clutch their pearls. She'd spent time in the French court, where flirtation was practically a sport, and returned to England with a twinkle in her eye, and possibly a few stories she didn't write down. Henry VIII noticed her immediately. Their affair was brief, bold, and wrapped in velvet secrecy. Some historians whisper that one, or even both, of Mary's children might have been Henry's, but the evidence is as flimsy as a Tudor ruff in a thunderstorm. No royal acknowledgement, no dukedoms, just rumors, raised eyebrows, and a few suspiciously ginger-haired toddlers. Mary's reward for her royal romance? A quiet exit, a marriage to a man with fewer titles and more debts, and a lifetime of watching her younger sister rise to power, steal the spotlight, and eventually lose her head, literally. But Mary survived. She outlived Anne. She outlived Henry. She outlived the drama. And in a court where love could be lethal, survival was the ultimate victory. I remember Mary Boleyn, the sister who loved first, lost quietly, and lived to tell absolutely none of it. If courtship were a chess match, Anne Boleyn was the queen, who knew how to checkmate with a smirk. She didn't just flirt, she strategized. She didn't just love, she negotiated. And when Henry VIII came knocking with his usual bouquet of ego and entitlement, Anne didn't open the door. She made him wait. Unlike her sister Mary, Anne didn't settle for being a mistress. She wanted the crown, the power, and the full royal package, including the headaches. She danced at court, dazzled with her wit, and wore sleeves so long they could hide a treaty. Henry was hooked, obsessed, bewitched, and possibly bewigged. Their courtship was a slow burn, like a candle that refused to flicker out. Henry wrote her love letters so dramatic they could have been performed in a tavern. He promised her everything, except patience. And when Anne finally agreed to marry him, the king broke with the Pope, the Church, and half of Europe, just to make it happen. Anne became queen. She gave birth to Elizabeth I, who would later rule with more grace and fewer husbands. But Anne's reign was short, sharp, and scandalous. She was accused of everything from witchcraft to flirting with her brother, which, to be clear, is not a recommended royal pastime. In 1536, she was executed, her head removed with a French sword, and a very English sense of regret. But Anne's legacy lingered. She changed history. She birthed a queen. And she proved that sometimes the most powerful lover isn't the one who whispers, but the one who rewrites the rules. Anne Boleyn, the queen who played the long game, won the crown, and paid the price. And if your dreams get dramatic, blame the Tudors. In the royal court of Henry VIII, love was never simple. It was embroidered, entangled, and occasionally related by blood. Enter Madge Shelton, Anne Boleyn's cousin, Henry's maybe mistress, and the human embodiment of "this is awkward." Madge was young, flirtatious, and had the kind of courtly charm that made noblemen trip over their own titles. She was part of Anne's inner circle, which meant she spent her days arranging flowers, whispering secrets, and trying not to get seduced by the king. Spoiler, she may have failed at that last part. Historians aren't entirely sure how far things went between Madge and Henry. Some say it was a brief affair, a flicker of flirtation, while Anne was busy being queen. Others suggest it was more serious, a full-blown romance tucked between jousts and diplomatic disasters. Either way, it was messy, because nothing says family loyalty like stealing your cousin's husband. Anne, understandably, was not thrilled. Having your cousin cozy up to your royal spouse is the Tudor equivalent of being unfollowed on Instagram and then subtweeted in Latin, but Henry was Henry, restless, romantic, and always ready to chase the next velvet shadow. Madge eventually faded from the spotlight, like a candle snuffed out before dawn. She married, moved on, and left behind a legacy of court gossip and confused genealogists. Her name lingered in letters, in rumors, and in the occasional awkward family reunion. Madge Shelton, the cousin who complicated everything, flirted with fate, and taught us that in Tudor England, love triangles often had four sides, and possibly a lute solo. In the Tudor court, where politics wore perfume and ambition danced in silk slippers, few events stirred more excitement and more scandal than the royal masques. These were no ordinary parties. They were theatrical spectacles of music, movement, and masked flirtation. And for Henry VIII, they were the perfect playground for romantic mischief. The Mask of Maidens was one such evening. The hall was transformed into a dreamscape of velvet drapes, flickering torches, and perfumed air thick with anticipation. Courtiers wore elaborate costumes, nymphs, knights, mythical creatures, and masks that concealed just enough to make every glance feel like a secret. Henry, of course, was the center of it all, dressed as a Roman god, because modesty was never his strong suit. He surveyed the room like a hawk in heat. Around him danced a dozen young women, maids of honor, noble daughters, and the occasional ambitious niece, each hoping to catch the king's eye, and maybe, just maybe, his heart. But in the masquerade, identities blurred. A wink could be mistaken for a promise. A touch of the hand could lead to a rumor, and a whispered compliment beneath a feathered mask could echo through the court for weeks. It was a night of illusion, where love was both a game and a gamble. Some say Henry fell for one of the dancers that night. Others claim he flirted with three. The truth, like the masks, remains hidden. But what is so certain is that the Mask of Maidens became legend. A night when the king danced not just with women, but with possibility. And as the music faded and the masks were removed, the court returned to its usual rhythm of gossip and gowns. But the memory of that night lingered like perfume on a silk sleeve. The Mask of Maidens, a royal reverie where every dance was a secret, and every secret was a step closer to scandal. Long before Henry VIII was buried beneath layers of regret and roast beef, he was a young king with a taste for foreign flair, and nothing said continental temptation quite like Jane Popincourt, a French-born lady-in-waiting with a name that sounded like perfume and a reputation that made courtiers raise their eyebrows and lower their voices. Jane arrived in England as part of the diplomatic entourage, fluent in French, fashion, and flirtation. She was elegant, educated, and had the kind of poise that made English noblewomen feel like they'd overdressed for breakfast. Henry noticed her immediately. She wasn't just beautiful. She was exotic, mysterious, and spoke with an accent that made even his Latin sound clumsy. Their affair was never officially confirmed, but the whispers were louder than a lute solo in a wine cellar. Jane was said to have caught the king's eye during court festivities, where her dancing was graceful and her glances were loaded. She may have been involved with other nobles too, because in Tudor England, love was rarely monogamous and never boring. But Jane's story wasn't just about romance. She was a survivor of court politics, navigating the treacherous waters of favor and scandal with the finesse of someone who knew when to smile and when to disappear. Eventually, she returned to France, leaving behind a trail of perfume, poetry, and speculation. Henry, of course, moved on. He always did. But Jane Popincourt remained one of the earliest and most elegant figures in his gallery of secret lovers. She was the French fancy who danced through the English court and left before the music stopped. Picture Jane in a silk gown, gliding across a candlelit hall, her eyes meeting the king's for just a moment, too long. And remember, in the Tudor court, even a glance could be a love story. Before emojis, before texting, before the scandalous power of a well-timed "hey," there were letters. And when Henry VIII fell in love or lust, he didn't whisper sweet nothings. He wrote them, lavishly, obsessively, sometimes embarrassingly. His love letters were drenched not just in ink, but in ego, longing, and the unmistakable scent of royal desperation. Henry wasn't subtle. He wrote with the intensity of a man who believed every metaphor was a masterpiece and every compliment a coronation. His letters to Anne Boleyn are the most famous, pages filled with declarations of devotion, jealousy, and the occasional awkward reference to her body. He called her darling, sweetheart, and once my mistress and friend, which, in Tudor terms, was basically a marriage proposal and a pickup line rolled into one. But Anne wasn't the only recipient. Henry wrote to other women too, mistresses, muses, and maybe even a few who never replied. His handwriting was bold, his phrasing theatrical, and his punctuation wildly inconsistent. He poured out his heart with the flair of a man who knew he could rewrite laws, but not always win love. These letters weren't just romantic. They were strategic, a way to woo, to flatter, to manipulate. They were part of the courtship dance, where every word was a step and every pause a potential scandal. And when the letters didn't work, Henry simply tried again, or married someone else. Some of these letters survive, tucked away in archives and dusty libraries. They reveal a king who was powerful but insecure, adored but often alone, a man who ruled with iron but loved with ink. The letters, drenched in ink, ego, and the kind of longing that even a crown couldn't quiet. In a palace bursting with politics and pageantry, sometimes the most honest moments happened far from the throne, not in the council chamber, not in the ballroom, but in the gardens, where petals softened secrets and hedges hid hearts. Welcome to the world of the garden trysts. Henry VIII's court was a theater of ambition, but the gardens were its backstage, beneath the sculpted yews and beside the murmuring fountains. Lovers met in silence. The air was thick with jasmine and danger. A glance exchanged during supper could lead to a midnight rendezvous beneath the moonlit arbor. The king himself was no stranger to these leafy escapes. When the weight of the crown grew heavy, or when a lady's smile lingered too long, he'd slip away from the feast and into the shadows. There, among the roses and the rustling leaves, he'd find her, a maid of honor, a noble's daughter, a woman whose name history might forget, but whose perfume lingered in the folds of his memory. These trysts were brief, stolen, and never spoken of. A kiss behind the trellis, a whispered vow beneath the wisteria, sometimes just a touch of the hand, enough to spark a scandal if seen. But the gardens kept their secrets well. They were the only place in court where titles didn't matter, and silence was sacred. Some say Anne Boleyn met Henry there before she wore the crown. Others whisper that Jane Seymour walked with him among the tulips while Anne still reigned. The truth is tangled in vines and rumor. But one thing is certain, the garden was more than a place. It was a promise of escape, of intimacy, of love, however fleeting. The garden trysts, the moments when power paused, hearts spoke, and the king became just a man beneath the stars. In a court where words were weapons and glances were currency, music offered a rare escape, a moment of softness in a world of sharp ambition, and no one played that escape more beautifully than the lady with the lute. Her name, like her melodies, has faded into the folds of history. Some say she was a noblewoman, others claim she was the daughter of a court musician, trained in the art of harmony and discretion. What is certain is that she played the lute with a grace that made even the most hardened courtiers pause mid-scheme. Henry VIII, ever drawn to beauty in all its forms, was captivated, not just by her music, but by the way she held herself, poised, serene, and utterly unbothered by the chaos around her. She didn't chase favor. She didn't flutter her lashes. She simply played, and in doing so, became unforgettable. Their connection was quiet. No grand affair. No scandalous letters. Just evenings in the gallery, where her fingers danced across strings, and the king listened, eyes closed, as if trying to remember what peace felt like in a life filled with noise, political, romantic, and otherwise. Her music was a lullaby for his restless soul. Some whispered that she was more than a musician, that behind the soft chords lay a sharp mind, and behind the gentle smile, a heart that knew exactly how far to stay from danger. Whether she ever shared Henry's bed is unknown, but she certainly shared his attention, and in Tudor England, that was often more powerful. Eventually, she disappeared from court records. Perhaps she married. Perhaps she left. Perhaps she simply knew that in a place where love could be lethal, silence was the safest song. The lady with the lute, the woman who played for a king, soothed a storm and proved that sometimes the quietest notes leave the loudest echoes. In a court filled with silk and ceremony, where every glance could be a gamble and every whisper a wager, sometimes love came from the most unexpected corners, not from a duchess or a lady-in-waiting, but from someone with feathers on her gloves and wind in her hair. Enter the falconer's daughter. Her name has been lost to history, tucked away in the margins of forgotten letters and half-burned diaries. But her story fluttered through the court like one of her father's hawks, swift, silent, and impossible to ignore. She was the daughter of the royal falconer, raised among birds of prey, with eyes sharp as talons, and a spirit that refused to be caged. Henry first noticed her during a hunt, while others fumbled with reins and flattered with poetry. She stood calmly beside her falcon, commanding it with a flick of her wrist and a whisper only the bird could hear. The king was intrigued. She wasn't dressed for court. She didn't curtsy like a lady. But she had something rarer, confidence without calculation. Their connection was quiet. No grand declarations, no jeweled gifts, just stolen moments in the muse, where falcons rested and secrets flew. She taught Henry how to handle the birds, how to read their moods, how to trust their instincts, and in return, he gave her something few ever received, his undivided attention. Was it love? Perhaps. Was it an affair? Possibly. Was it a story worth telling? Absolutely. But like all things in Henry's life, it didn't last. She vanished from court records. Perhaps married off. Perhaps dismissed. Perhaps simply wise enough to leave before the drama began. Her falcons remained, circling the skies above Hampton Court, as if still watching over the king who once dared to love a woman without a title, the falconer's daughter, the woman who soared above scandal, whispered to hawks, and taught a king that sometimes the wildest hearts are the hardest to hold. In the grand halls of Henry VIII's court, where power wore perfume and secrets rustled beneath silk, there were eyes everywhere, but none more overlooked or more dangerous than those of the pages, young boys in fine livery, trained to be silent, swift, and invisible. One such boy, whose name history forgot, saw everything and remembered more than he should have. He was barely 15, with quick hands and quicker instincts. He fetched goblets, delivered letters, and stood quietly in corners, while kings whispered and queens wept. He knew how to walk without echo, how to listen without blinking, and how to vanish before anyone noticed he'd been there at all. He saw the queen's ladies slip into side chambers with flushed cheeks. He saw the king's hand linger too long on a shoulder. He carried notes sealed with wax and scented with danger. He watched as courtiers traded favors like coins, and as alliances shifted with the tilt of a jeweled head. But the page never spoke, not aloud, not to anyone. He knew that in a court like Henry's, knowledge was both power and poison. One wrong word could mean exile, or worse. So he kept his secrets tucked behind his eyes, each one a thread in the tapestry of Tudor intrigue. Some say he once intercepted a letter meant for Anne Boleyn, one that could have changed everything. Others whisper that he saw the king in a moment of weakness, weeping alone after Jane Seymour's death. A few believe he was bribed, threatened, even followed. But no one could ever prove what he knew, or how much. Eventually, he disappeared from the records. Perhaps he was promoted. Perhaps he fled. Perhaps he simply knew when to leave before the walls began to whisper his name. But the legend of the page who knew too much lingered, passed from servant to servant like a bedtime warning. The page, not noble, not powerful, not even named, just a boy with a sharp mind, a quiet soul, and a memory that could have toppled a throne. In the glittering world of Tudor court life, the Queen's ladies were more than just attendants. They were confidants, companions, and silent witnesses to the drama that unfolded behind velvet curtains. They dressed the Queen, dined with her, danced beside her, and sometimes caught the eye of the king himself. It was a dangerous position to be beautiful, witty, and within arm's reach of Henry VIII was to live on a knife's edge. Loyalty to the Queen was expected, but when the king smiled, when he lingered a little too long at the edge of a conversation, when he requested a dance or a private word, loyalty could blur. Some ladies resisted, others didn't. History whispers of Madge Shelton, Mary Boleyn, and Anne Bassett. women who began as maids of honor and ended up tangled in the king's affections. Their rise was swift, their reputations fragile, and their futures uncertain. In a court ruled by favor, a single glance could change everything, but not every lady was lured. Some remained fiercely loyal to their queens, shielding them from gossip, guarding their secrets, and refusing the king's advances with quiet dignity. These women rarely made the history books, but they were the backbone of the court, the silent strength behind the crown. The queen herself often knew. She saw the glances, heard the whispers, and sometimes even chose her ladies with caution. Anne Boleyn was said to have dismissed women she suspected of catching Henry's eye. Catherine Howard, tragically, surrounded herself with ladies who encouraged her own dangerous flirtations. It was a delicate dance between duty and desire, between loyalty and ambition. The Queen's ladies lived in a world where beauty was currency, silence was survival, and every smile could be a test. The Queen's ladies, the women who stood beside power, sometimes protected it, sometimes betrayed it, and always walked the line between loyal and lured. In the glittering maze of Tudor court life, where ambition wore pearls and secrets hid behind embroidery, Anne Bassett stood out, not just for her beauty, but for her boldness. She wasn't a queen, nor a duchess, nor even a confirmed mistress, but she was something far more dangerous. A young woman with charm, connections, and the uncanny ability to make Henry VIII pause mid-sentence. Anne was the daughter of Honor Grenville and the stepdaughter of Lord Lisle, the king's representative in Calais. Her family was well-positioned, politically savvy, and just scandalous enough to be interesting. When Anne arrived at court, she was barely out of her teens, but already knew how to navigate the velvet jungle of flirtation and favor. Henry noticed her quickly. She was vivacious, clever, and had the kind of confidence that made older courtiers whisper and younger ones swoon. Rumors swirled that she became the king's mistress sometime after Jane Seymour's death, though no official record confirms it. Still, the gossip was persistent, like a lute player who refuses to stop after midnight. Anne's flirtation with the king may have been brief, or it may have been deeper than history dares to admit. Some even speculated she might become queen, but Henry, ever unpredictable, chose other paths and other women. Anne remained at court, serving as a maid of honor to multiple queens, her name always hovering near the edge of scandal. She was known for her wit, her poise, and her ability to survive the shifting tides of royal favor. In a court where one wrong glance could lead to exile or worse, Anne managed to stay afloat. She eventually married Sir Walter Hungerford, a respectable match that came with fewer poems and more peace. But her legacy lingered, a woman who danced with danger, flirted with power, and may have held the king's heart, if only for a moment. Anne Bassett was bold, beautiful, and brilliantly elusive. She played the game with grace, never overreaching, never fading completely. She was the kind of woman who could turn heads in a crowded hall and vanish before the gossip caught up. And in a court ruled by drama, that was a rare and royal skill. Anne Bassett, the bold beauty who walked the line between mistress and myth and left behind a trail of perfume and possibility. In the heart of Hampton Court, nestled between the chapel and the Queen's chambers, there stood a wall, ordinary in appearance, stone, ivy-clad, and sun-warmed by day, But by night, it became something else entirely: a confidant, a witness, a keeper of secrets. The courtiers called it the whispering wall. No one knew who first discovered its strange gift. Perhaps a page, leaning too close. Perhaps a lady in waiting, murmuring a forbidden name. But the wall had a way of carrying sound. Soft voices traveled along its surface, curving around corners, slipping through cracks, until they reached ears that were never meant to hear. Henry VIII himself was said to have used it, not for spying, at least not officially, but for listening. He'd stand at one end, hands behind his back, while his courtiers whispered at the other, unaware that their secrets were sliding straight into royal memory. Affairs, alliances, betrayals, all spilled like wine on velvet. The wall became legend. Lovers met beside it, thinking its ivy would shield them. Ministers plotted near it, trusting the silence. But the wall heard everything, and in a court where knowledge was power, it became the most dangerous thing that didn't wear a crown. Anne Boleyn was rumored to have stood there once, whispering to her brother. Catherine Howard may have giggled there with Thomas Culpeper. Even Jane Seymour, quiet and cautious, was said to have paused there in prayer. Her words carried farther than she knew. Eventually, the wall faded into myth. New monarchs came. New scandals bloomed. But the stone remained, cool and quiet, still listening. And if you visit Hampton Court today, some say you can still hear echoes, soft voices from centuries past, murmuring secrets that never quite died. The whispering wall, the silent witness to love, betrayal, and the kind of secrets that only stone can keep. In the glittering world of Henry VIII's court, love was rarely quiet. It came wrapped in silk, sealed with wax, and often accompanied by something small, exquisite, and dangerously meaningful. A favor could be anything: a ribbon, a ring, a locket, a glove. A token passed from hand to hand, heart to heart. It was a promise, a flirtation, a secret stitched into satin. And in Henry's court, where every gesture was watched and every whisper weighed, a favor could speak louder than a sonnet. Henry gave many. He was a king of grand gestures and impulsive passions. He gifted pearls to Mary Boleyn, a jeweled brooch to Anne, a miniature portrait to Jane Seymour, each item chosen not just for beauty, but for message. A sapphire meant loyalty, a ruby, desire, a handkerchief embroidered with initials, practically a proposal. But favors weren't just given, they were kept, hidden in bodices, tucked into prayer books, sewn into sleeves. Some women treasured them, others feared them, because a favor from the king could elevate you or destroy you. One day, you were the object of royal affection. The next, you were a scandal in embroidery. And what of the favors forgotten? The ones left behind in drawers, dropped in gardens, or buried with their owners. A ring with no finger, a letter with no reply, a token once kissed, now crumbling with time. These are the ghosts of courtly love, the silent souvenirs of a king's restless heart. Some say a box of such favors still exists, hidden in the depths of Hampton Court, a velvet-lined chest filled with trinkets and tears. No names, no explanations, just the echo of 1,000 whispered promises, the forgotten favors, the gifts that once meant everything, and now lie quietly, waiting to be remembered, in a court where every affair left a footprint. On parchment, in poetry, or in scandal, there was one woman who left behind nothing but questions. No portrait, no letters, no confirmed name, just a whisper in the margins of history. She is known only as the mistress who vanished. The story begins, as so many do, with a glance. She was said to be neither noble nor titled, but striking in a way that made even the most jeweled courtiers fade beside her. Some claimed she was the daughter of a foreign envoy. Others believed she was a lady's maid with a secret lineage. Whoever she was, she caught Henry's eye during a summer progress, one of those long, lavish journeys through the countryside where the king hunted deer by day and harts by night. She appeared suddenly at court, dressed modestly, but with unmistakable grace. She danced once at a masque, her face half hidden behind a silver mask. Henry watched her all evening. The next day, she was summoned to his private chambers, and then, nothing. No records, no gifts, no scandal, no dismissal. She simply vanished. Some say she fled, terrified of the attention. Others believe she was sent away, perhaps by a jealous rival or a cautious queen. A few whispered darker theories, that she was silenced, hidden, erased. But the truth remains elusive, like perfume on parchment. What makes her story so haunting is not what we know, but what we don't. In a court obsessed with recording every flirtation and favor, her absence is louder than any affair. She became a ghost in the royal narrative, a reminder that not every love story ends in marriage, execution, or memory. The mistress who vanished, the woman who stepped into the king's gaze, and then into legend. In the royal kitchens of Henry VIII's court, where steam curled like gossip and spices whispered of faraway lands, love simmered in the most unexpected corners. Amid the clatter of copper pots and the scent of roasting meats, there moved a girl with flour on her sleeves and fire in her eyes. The cook's daughter. She wasn't nobility. She didn't wear pearls or silks, but she knew the secrets of saffron and the power of a well-timed pastry. Her father was the king's master cook, trusted with feasts that could sway foreign ambassadors and soothe royal tempers. She, meanwhile, was trusted with something far more delicate, the preparation of the king's favorite spiced wine. It was a blend of red wine, honey, cinnamon, and a hint of clove, warming, intoxicating, and just bold enough to be remembered. Henry adored it, and when he asked who made it, she was summoned. She arrived with her head bowed, cheeks flushed, and hands still stained with nutmeg. The king was intrigued. She was unlike the women of court. No practiced flirtation, no rehearsed curtsy, just quiet confidence and the scent of cardamom. He asked her about the recipe. She told him about her travels to the spice markets with her father, about the way cinnamon should crack when fresh, about how wine should be stirred clockwise to coax out sweetness. Their conversations grew longer. She began delivering the wine herself, always at dusk, when the court grew quiet and the king grew restless. Some say he kissed her once, in the warmth of the cellar. Others say he simply watched her hands as she worked, mesmerized by the grace of someone who never tried to impress him. But she never stayed long. She knew her place and her limits. She returned to the kitchens, to the pots and the pans and the safety of steam. Eventually, she vanished from court records, perhaps married to a merchant, perhaps lost to time, but the recipe remained, and every time Henry tasted that wine, he remembered her, the cook's daughter, the girl who stirred more than wine and left behind a flavor the king could never quite forget. By the end of his reign, Henry VIII was no longer the golden prince who danced at masques and whispered beneath moonlit arches. He was older, heavier, haunted. His court had grown quieter. His wives, 6 in total, were gone, buried, divorced, or beheaded. His body ached. His heart, perhaps, even more. But even kings dream. In the final months of his life, Henry was said to speak in his sleep. Servants reported murmurs from behind velvet curtains, names half-formed, phrases lost to the hush of candlelight. Sometimes he called out for Anne, sometimes Jane, once, strangely, for a woman no one recognized, a name not recorded in any ledger, not whispered in any scandal, just a soft syllable, repeated like a prayer. He dreamed of gardens, of music, of laughter, echoing down long-forgotten corridors. He dreamed of a hand reaching for his, not in ambition, but in comfort. He dreamed of a kiss that wasn't political, a glance that didn't calculate. He dreamed of love, not the kind that crowns queens, but the kind that quiets kings. Some say his final dream was of a hunt, his favorite pastime. But in this dream, he didn't chase. He was chased, not by prey, but by memory, by the women who had shaped his life, for better or worse. They appeared not as rivals, but as reflections, each one holding a piece of him he'd never reclaimed. And when he awoke, he said nothing, just stared at the ceiling, as if trying to hold on to the dream before it slipped away. Henry VIII died in January 1547, but perhaps, in those last moments, he found something he'd never quite grasped in life, a glimpse of peace, wrapped in velvet and silence, the king's last dream, not of power, not of conquest, but of love, the kind that lingers, even when the crown is laid down. Not every love story in Henry VIII's court was written in letters or carved into scandal. Some were whispered in passing, hidden behind tapestries, or folded into the silence between verses of a lute song. These were the lovers history forgot, the ones who never wore crowns, never caused uprisings, and never made it into the official records, but they loved just the same. There were chambermaids who caught the king's eye for a single season, foreign visitors whose accents lingered longer than their names, daughters of minor nobles who danced once, laughed once, and were remembered only in the way Henry paused when that song played again. Some were never truly lovers, just moments, a shared glance in the garden, a hand brushed against another during a prayer, a conversation that lasted too long, too late, too close to the fire. These women didn't seek power. They didn't chase titles. They simply existed in the margins, where real life often hides. And Henry, for all his grandeur, was still a man, beneath the armor, beneath the ego, beneath the crown. He longed for connection, for softness, for someone who saw him not as a monarch, but as a man who, sometimes, needed to be listened to, not obeyed. The lovers history forgot were the ones who gave him that, briefly, quietly, without consequence. And then they disappeared, into marriage, into exile, into anonymity. But their stories linger, like perfume on parchment, like footprints in frost. So, tonight, as you close the final chapter and let the candle burn low, remember them, the unnamed, the unrecorded, the unforgettable, the lover's history, forgot. Sleep softly now, beneath your imagined canopy of velvet and stars. The court is quiet, the king is dreaming, and history, for once, is at peace. Good night.